Okay, so my presentation is about how do organ transplant teams decide who gets the organ. So here's my table of contents for this presentation. This is just an overview of everything I'm going to be covering. First, we're going to start with the background, which is just going to provide some history and what organs can actually be transplanted. Then we're going to have information about the transplant waitlist, then determining factors for receiving a transplant, how location affects recipients, and then the conclusion. So, for history, in 1984, Congress passed the National Organ Transplant Act, NOTA, in order to regulate the distribution process. The primary purpose of NOTA was to establish the Organ Procurement and Transplantation Network, also known as Opt-in. Opt-in essentially maintains the names of individuals who need transplants when organs become available and matches organs to appropriate patients. If you've ever heard of a transplant waitlist, Opt-in essentially regulates all of that information. To maintain this network, a contract was formed with the United Network for Organ Sharing, UNOS, and has remained ever since. So to this day, our organ transplant regulation is through these networks and this contract. So next we have what organs can be transplanted. These include heart/heart valves, skin, kidneys, tendons, pancreas, liver, lungs, and corneas. Donation procedure for each organ differs slightly. Okay, so the first step to getting a transplant is meeting the requirements to make it on the wait list. Screening committees evaluate to see if a patient is eligible for a transplant and what rank they will actually receive on the wait list. This is a necessary process since there is such scarcity of transplantable organs. They need to determine who will benefit most from them. So some of the considerations for the wait list include cause of organ failure. Committees will screen a patient to see if there was organ failure due to any drug or substance problems, because they don't want to give an organ to someone who is going to continue to have substance problems because then it was for no reason. Then comorbidities. For those that don't know, this is essentially saying that a patient has one or more disease or condition at once. When considering someone for the transplant waitlist, screening committees want to make sure that someone is able to make it through surgery, and they want to make sure that their body is strong enough to do so. Then we have health habits and patient adherence. This is just to make sure that the patient is willing to keep their body healthy after the transplant and give the organ an environment to work with their other systems. Then we have financial support. Transplants as is are very expensive, and if the patient doesn't have insurance, they need to be able to pay for the donation out of pocket. And then finally, we have social value. In the medical world, this one is a little more controversial. Essentially, what it's saying is if the patient is given the chance to live by getting an organ, will they do good in our society? So the textbook gives several examples of this, but a good example is someone who has committed crimes versus someone who is an activist. They're obviously going to want to give it to the activist because they know that they have done good in the past and they will probably continue to do so. Patients cannot be placed on wait lists of multiple local transplant centers. They must be placed on a single wait list for each type of organ. And then waitlist times are routinely examined to make sure that certain groups of patients aren't discriminated. So every once in a while, they will look through the wait lists and look through the specific patients and make sure that everyone is being treated equally and no specific groups are being discriminated against or being left out. So for determining factors for receiving a transplant, we have medical urgency. This is just basically talking about the severity of a patient's condition. Then we have likelihood of finding a suitable organ in the future. This is discussing how common the organ that they need is donated. So, for example, since the skin is a larger area and gets donated more frequently, someone is more likely to get that donated than something smaller like the kidneys. Then we have waitlist timing, blood type. So if blood types are incompatible, antibodies in your blood will reject the organ. So we have to make sure that the donor and the recipient are the same blood type. And then we have first time versus repeat transplants. Sometimes a person's body will reject a transplanted organ, which would mean that they need to go back on the wait list. So screening teams and doctors will need to look into this patient and see why they rejected it in the first place and if they have the potential to reject another organ in the future. Then we have age. Younger patients have a higher likelihood of getting a transplant compared to someone that is older. And then we have geographical fairness, which is touched on in the next slide. Okay, so how location affects receiving a transplant. Our current allocation system favors placing organs within local patients. So essentially, if an organ donor passes away in one hospital and a recipient who is a match is in that same hospital, they will most likely get that organ before other patients. If an organ is unable to be placed locally, then it will be offered to patients within UNOS, which is multi-state. So it broadens the region just a little bit. And then, if an organ has failed to be placed regionally, it will then be offered to patients nationwide. Okay, so in conclusion, the scarcity of organ transplants allow for screening teams to be extremely methodical and precise with what people get put on the wait list and where they rank. So based on the information in my previous slides, it is apparent that there is many different criteria that needs to be met. Following this, getting the actual transplant has its own specific standards which separates recipients from one another. Specifically talking about my information on the transplant waitlist slide, I discussed the aspect of social value. And although this is highly debated and controversial, it does separate certain recipients from one another. So that's why it is a consideration for the waitlist. Such particular criteria allows for the morals and motives behind who gets chosen in the organ transplant process to be highly debated and argued. And then here are all my references.